This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Thank you to my latest raters and reviewers. Thank you to Ruby for reviewing the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store. Remember, you can review the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store, on podchaser.com, and you can rate the podcast on Spotify. As usual, we will have our Tuesday evening Deconversion Anonymous hangout on Facebook Rooms with this week's guest. So be there on Tuesday night at 5:30 Pacific, 8:30 Eastern. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's episode. On to today's show. My guest today is Seth. Seth was a young Earth creationist who ultimately got his dream job working for Answers in Genesis and the Creation Museum, only to find out that you should never meet your heroes. Seth also jumped into the Hebrew Roots movement and lived kosher for about 3 years until several things, including young Earth creationism and some specific Hebrew Roots theology, began to stretch his faith beyond what it could bear. And he suddenly realized that he could no longer believe and he was an atheist. Here is Seth to tell his story. Seth, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you.
Hey, Seth, so you have been a part of the Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group, our little community that Arlene is running, and you've asked me multiple times to be on the show, and I've been pushing you off, but finally you're here. I'm very glad to have you.
Oh, thank you. I hope my story is not too boring for you.
No, I think everyone's story is unique, and there'll definitely be people that relate. But let's start at the beginning, as we always do. What is the faith tradition that you grew up with?
I grew up in kind of a non-denominational Christian church. I guess theologically leaning Arminian, but I didn't really know what any of that was till I was in high school. Parents were both, they were Lutheran and Methodist when they grew up, but they got involved with Campus Crusade in college. And ever since then, they've been going to churches like that are just blank Christian church of whatever area they're in.
And early on for you, was it something that you took on for yourself, or was it primarily just something that you did with your parents?
Kind of both. I was always really studious, and I was also homeschooled through, I guess, about half of my education. And so there were times where I was more serious about my faith and times when I was less. But by the time I got into high school, I think I really made it my own. And I had gone back to public school in 10th grade and started going to church, to a really fundamentalist church with some friends from school. So that's kind of when it became serious for me.
Okay. So let's talk about that a bit more. So what was it that drew you to be more serious?
Well, when we first moved and I started in public school, the church that my parents were going to, I kind of pressured them to join because there was a girl in the church that I had a crush on.
Okay.
That didn't pan out, and I had a hard time making friends with other people in the youth group. They did like a lot of like watching movies and stuff like that. It just didn't seem very serious.
Okay.
So my friends in high school, I think, again, I got introduced to this group through a girl I liked. But
yeah.
Then after I started going there, they were just so much more studious than I'd ever encountered before. Really had like solid doctrines and everything. And from early on in school, they would like teach kids through the entire Bible multiple times and then teach them all the doctrines they believed. So it was really structured, really academic, and that kind of drew me to it.
Okay. All right. And how about the community aspect? Was it like the youth group itself was like fun or good to be in?
It was. The longer I'm out of Christianity, the more I get flashbacks of different things that were probably not very good.
Yeah.
And I definitely didn't totally feel like I fit in, but
Okay.
yeah, overall, I mean, while I was there, I enjoyed it and really liked being a part of a community.
Okay. So then like that is most of the way through high school for you, or like, does anything change then as you come to the end of high school?
Well, what changed, I think, the most was that church was really big into young Earth creationism.
Okay.
And the homeschool curriculum we had used had been young Earth creationist, but I didn't know anything. I mean, I didn't really follow it very well. I'd been exposed to that off and on from my dad, who he's like staunchly young Earth. My mom is like,
Okay.
whatever God did, I'll go with that.
Right.
Um, so like she didn't push it heavily in class work, but I by the time I was about 15 or so, I really was like devout young Earth creationist
Okay.
to the point where I was like after physics class was over, I would debate with my physics teacher, who was an old Earth creationist, over which model was correct. So
Interesting.
yeah,
Both of you people of faith, but arguing over the
yeah.
age of the Earth. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, my English paper in senior year was about the flood, so
Okay. Okay. Interesting.
that's the kind of person I was, and that has the biggest overall ramifications for, I guess, my whole professional, like academic professional life, as well as eventually leading to my deconstruction.
Okay, so young Earth creationists in high school, and then did you go on to college or like your young adulthood? Did anything change there?
Well, I had been kind of looking over the list of AIG approved schools that is in Genesis, and I had quite a few friends who were going to Cedarville University in Ohio, near Dayton, and that one kind of jumped out at me as a school I wanted to check out, especially because it was so close to the Creation Museum,
Okay.
which had just opened that year. So we went. My parents took me to the Creation Museum, and we went on a college visit, toured the museum, and I just loved it. So I decided. Well, my I didn't have a way to pay for it, and it's super expensive.
Yeah.
So I went into the Air Force ROTC and tried to get in. Well, with an engineering scholarship, and 2 years into that, realized I was terrible at math and not very
Okay.
good at handling the stress of school along with all my ROTC commitments. So
Right.
um, I decided to transfer out.
Okay.
Um, then I went back to a state school in Illinois and was there for the next 4 years, where I graduated. And the whole time, though, everything was devoted to young Earth creationism. I went into an unrelated degree, but I avoided any kind of math or any kind of science class I could to not expose myself to anything that would challenge me.
Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah, I think I knew it would be a challenge if I were to encounter it, so I just tried to avoid it.
Yeah, I completely understand. I know what you mean. Were any other, like, even within the humanities, there can be challenging aspects. But like, were there any professors that pushed you to think about your faith?
Yeah, a couple of them. I had to take a geology class as part of my degree, and the geology professor allowed me to do the work twice, where the first time I did it was the approved version, and then the second time was the AIG version. So
Okay.
I that was a fun class, mainly because I was like, I'll do what he wants, which is what I mean, all of the Christians are like cautioning kids, you've got to do what the professor wants, and then you have to know that it's not right.
Right.
Like I have any idea what I'm talking about. Um, so I did that.
Unrelated to young Earth creationism, but one of my favorite theology professors, I remember we'd get in these theology debates with all the students in the class, and I would say to my classmates, okay, it's great that we can have this debate, but you have to show that you understand what he just taught, right? So you have to
Mm-hmm.
actually be able to say, I learned the thing you are teaching me, and now I have other thoughts about that. But like they would fail to do that first step, and anyway,
Yeah, yeah.
sidebar.
Well, and then the other class that probably challenged me the most was Oh, I can't remember the exact class, but it was taught by a lady who was, she went to a Unitarian Universalist church. I know that because she had a couple of extra, like, outside of class functions there.
Okay.
But then she was really invested in Islam. The class, I think it was, might have been a world religions class actually, or like international cultures. But I was exposed to different ways of thinking in that class that kind of, I wouldn't say shook me, but like just made me think that there are other ways of viewing the world.
Yeah. Your mental model of the world grows as you know gain more cultural experience and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like you made it through college without really having near brushes, but nothing that really rocked your world. So what happens after college?
Well, the one other thing in college that I didn't
Okay.
mention yet is in the Christian group I was part of, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Um, they were like wackadoodle all over the place theologically.
Okay.
It was just a circus. But there was one girl there that I was really good friends with, and also had a crush on. Kind of a repeating theme in my life. And she was going into anthropology, and I
Ah,
remember we had some heated debates over how she was like compromising on the Bible and needed to be a young Earth creationist, and I think I sort of accused her of doing that for her degree.
okay.
Um, so that was the way I thought about things at that age.
Yeah. Really, I think anthropology must be the most dangerous subject for a very faithful fundamentalist believer because back
Hmm.
to what we just said a second ago that exposure to other cultures and that different group of people can have just tremendously diametrically opposed views that than you have is really challenging.
Yeah. Well, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but after deconstructing, I reached out to her again and was like, "Hey, I feel like I like really stupid for our conversations." And it turns
Yeah.
out she's an atheist now too. So,
Okay. 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 So definitely there were some challenges there,
mhm.
but then after college, what happens then?
Well, my degree was in economics, which is like the fourth or fifth thing I tried out and it finally stuck. I really didn't feel proficient enough in it to do that as a job. And where my parents lived, which is where I moved back home, the only industries were really state government and medical. So
Okay.
I hopped around with a couple of temporary jobs for a couple of years, and then I finally started a career at the post office that I really thought I would enjoy
Okay.
until about 3 months in, and I got a fender bender, and they fired me.
Oh, interesting. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So that was a big transition point in my life because let's see, that was February 2016. And I had a friend living in Cincinnati who invited me to come out and stay with him for the weekend to see if I could find any work.
Hmm.
And ended up getting a couple of different temporary jobs through that experience, but one of them was working at the Creation Museum. So
Fascinating. Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
so March 2016, I move out to Cincinnati, Kentucky area, and start working there part time.
In some ways, I imagine this would be kind of your ideal job
Hmm.
if you're a young Earth creationist. Okay.
Oh, I loved it.
Yeah.
I was in that role for about 6 months, just working 1 or 2 days a week with my other jobs. But then in September, after the Ark had opened, they were in need of more people to operate their point of sale, like the behind the scenes kind of product building,
Sure.
equipment management and stuff. So I got hired in on that role as full time, and it was like a dream come true for me, but also turned into not a very good experience.
Okay.
Um, like the expression "don't ever meet your heroes" is definitely true if your hero is Ken Ham or most of the other people involved there.
Okay. I can imagine. I can imagine.
Hmm.
I do want you to unpack that a little bit. Do you mean in the sense of he wasn't a good boss to work for, or do you mean in the sense of like the ideas were corrupt?
Both. Ken as a person has a really nice persona, but when you actually meet him and talk to him, it seems like he kind of blows you off, and there's sort of this feeling of like he's above everybody a little bit. And I
Okay.
don't know if he intends to portray that, but it definitely came across. All of the people who worked as the actual like on the ground staff at the Ark Encounter tried to avoid him as much as they could.
Okay.
Um, and not as much at the Creation Museum, but that's where you got your really devoted people who were there because they believed in the cause, not just they needed a job.
Right. Okay. So, other than trying to avoid Ken, were the other people that you were working with decent to work with?
For the most part, yeah, I would say anybody who was like management on down was generally pretty good. Upper management, I really didn't care for very much, apart from like one or two people. But like middle managers on down who actually were at the attractions, for the most part, were really great. My manager, in particular, was awesome, and he and I are still friends.
Okay.
So, and then up until fairly recently, I had kept up with a few of the other people who were there, but we've all kind of gone our separate ways recently.
Okay. All right. And how long were you working there?
I was there almost 3 years from when I started the original position. In During that whole time, I guess I should kind of step back a bit. When I first moved out here, I could not find a good church. The one that I thought was going to be my forever home, they were going through a change in leadership at the time. And the same week that I joined officially was the week they hired on the pastor that I really did not like. So that was
Okay.
my last Sunday there.
Okay. Yeah.
And I kind of floated around for a while, not sure where to go. But I had a friend of mine at work who was in what they call the Hebrew Roots movement. I don't know if you know anything about that.
Vaguely.
It's kind of like Messianic Judaism meets evangelicalism meets conspiracy theory.
Okay. Okay.
There's such a wide variety of different beliefs and ideas in Hebrew roots. It's really hard to quantify.
Yeah.
But the main things are they believe that the New Testament is a direct continuation of the Old Testament. So thematically, like Christians are brought into Israel, so they're still supposed to do the same things Israel does. And Jesus, like some of them say Jesus was God, some of them say he was just a man. But the point was for him to kind of restore Israel and bring up the Gentiles into Israel rather than creating this new entity.
Okay.
And while all that was going on, I was also going through intense doubt and scrutiny about the Trinity. I'd had periods off and on through my entire life where I really doubted it, but
Hmm.
I was terrified to actually admit it. So I would try like for hours to write up what I thought about it, try to explain it to myself.
Yeah.
And usually after showing it to my pastor, he would just pat me on the head and congratulate me for discovering a new heresy. So,
The Trinity is one of those doctrines that I think while you're in the bubble, you just kind of let it go. It's like, okay, it doesn't make logical sense, but this is God we're talking about. And you just let it go. But I think it has to be one of the most confusing, illogical, like unsubstantiated, even biblically, doctrines of fundamentalist Christianity. So it does not surprise me that would be a tripping point.
oh yeah, it makes absolutely no sense. I came across that quote at some point while I was trying to study it. If you, if you understand the Trinity, or how does it go? Um, Doubting the Trinity will cause you to lose your soul, but understanding the Trinity will cause you to lose your mind, or something like that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
I phrased it weirdly, but that was essentially the point of it.
Yeah.
One of my jobs in town before I got the full-time gig for AIG was working in food delivery. And I was friends with a homeless guy up in Cincinnati and tried to present the gospel to him. But I was terrified of getting it wrong. I didn't want him to believe the wrong theology, so I went into detail on all the doctrine. And as I was saying it, I realized I wouldn't believe it if I were hearing it from somebody else.
Right.
So that was a terrifying moment. I kind of brushed it under the rug until 2017, when I became friends with the woman from Hebrew Roots, and realized as I was getting involved in that there were a lot of them that didn't believe in the Trinity. And
Okay.
that was kind of the beginning of the end, but I didn't know it at the time.
Sure. So how deep into Hebrew Roots did you get personally?
Oh, very.
Okay.
I wish I still had a set just to show somebody, but I used to make these little blue tassels that would hang on your belt loops.
Okay.
And that was like a definitive sign. I had a big beard because you're not supposed to cut your sides of your head. I spent several $100s on different memorabilia, like a shofar, menorahs, stuff like that.
Okay.
Went to different conferences. Other than the occasional accidental slip up, I was entirely kosher the whole time. Um, Kind of resented having to celebrate Christian holidays with my family because I just wanted to do the Jewish ones, the ones that Jesus kept.
Right.
Um, so I was very invested. And from the outside perspective, people kept telling me that I was becoming more and more legalistic, and that was a common accusation I got. But for me personally, I deconstructed my view on hell. I went from eternal conscious torment to conditional immortality. And I was kind of on the way to universalism, but I don't think I'd quite gotten there yet. Um, and So that was going on. And then also, it occurred to me pretty early on that if I was right, then that means everybody else had to be wrong. And
Yeah.
I couldn't reconcile like millions or billions of Christians who were all genuine believers who really were faithful and genuinely confused. I couldn't reconcile God just sending them to hell because they were wrong about who he was or who Jesus was or what they had to obey in the Torah and stuff like that.
Right.
So, like for myself, I was becoming more legalistic, but towards everybody else, I was becoming more gracious. But all I got was accusations of legalism.
And do you think that was more because there were Christians around you who were threatened by this change of theology, or do you think it was because you truly were becoming more legalistic?
No, I think it's the former.
Okay.
I mean, for myself, I was becoming more legalistic, but I didn't hold anybody else to that standard other than like trying, like suggesting it, but I never said
Yeah.
anybody had to do it or anything.
Got it. Okay.
Um, what was happening, or what I realize now, I've got kind of this hypothesis that Christians primarily base their ideas about God and their theology off of their own minds and what their own opinions tell them about the world, but they interpret that as God speaking to them because they
Right.
were conditioned to think that way. So then they only use the Bible as a supplement when they need to back up their opinion and say, "Oh,
Mm.
here it's in the Word of God. You've got to believe it."
Yeah.
But otherwise, they don't really care what the Bible says. They've got an excuse for anything in there that they don't agree with. Oh, that was only given to the people in Corinth, or that was only given to the Jews. Um, and So there's always a way out of everything they didn't agree with. But like I'd grown up hearing that I was going to be a pastor or a professor or something like that, going to write books on theology. And then as I was learning all this stuff and trying to explain what I was learning, I was getting so much resistance from everybody I knew because it didn't agree with what they thought was true.
I think for sure one of the milestones along the deconstruction path is the recognition that there is no right interpretation of the Bible. There are just interpretations. and
Mm-hmm.
that and that when you begin to see the disparity between the interpretations, even amongst people within the same church, things begin to unravel at that point.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So moving on then, it's very common for people to become even more dedicated when they, semi-convert. And it sounds like you had a slight conversion experience. You're still a Christian, but more of this Hebrew roots. So what jarred you in that environment? Like, what was it that started to have more questions for you there?
Well, I know you're not doing a video for the recording, but I would kind of say my trajectory of faith was an upward slope the whole time.
Okay.
I felt more and more secure in my beliefs and my practices and everything. And I probably would have stayed on that path forever. Um, what happened though is Answers in Genesis started requiring their staff to sign yearly statements of faith. I mean, it was the whole employee handbook, but
Yeah. Yeah.
including the statement of faith.
Yeah.
Um, in prior years, like I had expressed a little bit of this to my boss of what I was thinking, and he was like, "Keep it on the down low. I'm okay with you questioning these things, but don't bring it up because you'll get fired most likely."
Yeah.
And I knew of somebody else who'd been fired for somewhat similar things. And my friend who kind of got me into all this was getting a lot of harassment from some of the upper management who were also elders at the church she was attending. So it was just not a very healthy environment, and I was a little bit worried that I was going to get canned.
I want to interject here really quick. How did you feel about signing? Like when you knew you didn't really uphold those particular beliefs?
Well, in past years, I just kind of let it go because I wasn't really sure where I landed, and I don't think they were requiring us to sign every year. But in 2019, that was the first year they asked us to re-sign, and by that point, I had several things I knew I didn't agree on.
Yeah.
Um, so what really frustrates me about the organization is I knew of a lot of corruption, a lot of people doing things that would have gotten them fired, but they were related to people or their managers didn't report it or whatever. So like behavior stuff, they didn't really police that much, especially at the Ark. But for any self-reported commitment or disagreement of theology, like I was basically writing my own termination
Right. Right.
to do that. So I freaked out, didn't know what to do, prayed about it really hard. Over the course of 3 weeks, I landed a job where I currently work in a different department and turned in my resignation. So it was super quick. Everybody was nice about it though,
Okay.
and yeah. So then I got over to my current company.
The reason I say that is like, and I know I've told this story, but I'll tell it again. That my Bible college experience was bittersweet. You know, things that were infantilizing and bits that I can be very critical about. But on the whole, it was a really positive experience. I have
Mm-hmm.
deep friendships from that time still. And the professors were really, really good. And I joke that they were too good at their jobs. They taught me critical thinking and exegesis and hermeneutics and, interpretation of the Bible. And they were nuanced in that. And they represented a relative diversity of opinion. And then when I got done, I was graduated, had the degree in hand, and I was needed to get certified by my particular denomination to be a pastor. It was literally sign on the dotted line. You agree on these, 10
Mm-hmm.
statements of faith. And, I was probably 5 out of 10 of them, something
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that. And it was a soul wrenching moment. Like I did sign it. And even to this day, I feel bad about it. Like it was, I almost feel like at the time I should have stood up and just said no, because
Mm-hmm.
it was ridiculous, a limitation of a very narrow interpretation within a narrow interpretation. Right. And it just,
Mm-hmm.
that was kind of a defining moment in my life that I always think about. So,
Yeah. No, I get it.
so you were able to move on then. And I think that's a really big piece too, for many people who work for the church or work for a religious organization. That becomes very complicated when you start to doubt the tenets of faith, and the way you put food on the table is in jeopardy because of that. But it
Mm-hmm.
sounds like you were able to move on to a different position somewhere else. What happens at that point?
Well, I was still firmly entrenched in my belief. The previous fall, I had gone to this just incredible event for the Feast of Tabernacles. I was camping away in the woods for 8 days. We had just some of the most powerful worship music and teaching and prayer that I'd ever done. And it really, like, that was the first time in my life I think I really felt like God was in, like, present with us.
Okay.
Because I've always been very cerebral, so I've never felt like a close connection with God emotionally, but that was different. So then in 2019, after I'd quit, I went on another trip like that, but with a different group, and it did not go as well. For a variety of reasons, but it was much more uncomfortable. I didn't really feel connected or anything, and that kind of shook me a little bit. But at the same time, all through that summer and fall, I had kind of shifted my focus to wanting to understand the Bible in, like, the purest sense in its original context.
Okay.
So if Abraham would read Genesis, would he have gotten or come to the conclusion that Answers in Genesis teaches, or would he have read it in a completely different way? And that really bothered me because I suspected he wouldn't have known about young earth creationism.
Right.
Um, and I was still on that bandwagon theologically at the time. So over that fall, and I think it was even during that trip that I went on in September, I was listening to a bunch of different stuff about ancient Near Eastern views of cosmology. And I realized that Genesis and really most of the Bible, or all of it, presents the view that the earth is flat. And it has this recurring theme of the battle between Yahweh, or um, Jesus in the New Testament, and the Leviathan. And it's like a persistent theme from Genesis 1 through Revelation 21. So it was obviously very important. And that was something I was completely missing in my understanding of the world and theology. So I started to really look into that, and I got to a point where I felt like I had to either believe it literally or I couldn't believe it at all. And it was a super uncomfortable point because I knew a lot of flat earthers in the Hebrew Roots movement. I mentioned earlier they're really big into conspiracies, and that's one of them.
Okay. Got it.
And to my mom's credit, even though we were raised with young earth creationist homeschool material, she never she taught us real cosmology. So I knew the earth was a globe. I knew it was orbiting the sun in the Milky Way, stuff like that.
Right.
So I couldn't reconcile the two things in my head. And the analogy I kind of use is I call it my faith tendon, kind of like the Achilles heel. It felt like it was just getting stretched and stretched and stretched. And I really, like, for a few weeks, I tried to force myself to imagine the world was flat and made out of the cleaved body of Leviathan, and or felled body, or whatever the word is. And I tried to force myself to think that way, and there was a point, I don't remember where I was exactly, but I remember how it felt. It felt like part of my brain just broke, and
Yeah.
almost in an instant, I realized I couldn't believe anymore.
Wow.
But I tried for like 2 or 3 more months to cobble together some kind of belief, and like tried to reconcile with evolution, the little bit I understood. It just didn't work. And so the final moments for me, I was in a Mexican restaurant. I decided to be rebellious and get a burrito with pulled pork and shrimp, and had my first intentionally unkosher meal in 3 years. And I was hearing about coronavirus on the TV, not really sure what it was going on, kind of wondering if God was judging me. And that was like the very last of my belief escaping.
Wow. Wow. If you don't mind, I want to backtrack for just a second. And I think you've articulated something that's really important. So you are part of a community, this Hebrew Roots community. And even though you agreed with most of what they had to say, there's this one area, flat eartherism, that became important to that particular community, the one that you were in. And that was just a step too far for you.
Mm-hmm.
But you were still challenging, you were still trying to believe it. And I think one of the things that we don't understand well, even within the secular community, is how beliefs tend to follow our belonging in a community. And it's just a human nature kind of thing. And so even something as difficult to believe as flat eartherism, you were trying to make that happen because you wanted to remain a part of the community. Is that, you think that's an accurate statement, or am I misleading that?
Yeah, I mean the community for Hebrew Roots is all over the place. I didn't really have a good local group that I was part of,
Okay.
but that's definitely true. I mean, just Christianity in general, whatever form it took, was my entire first 30 years of life.
Right.
I don't remember anything in life that didn't involve it in some way, shape, or form. So finally realizing that I didn't believe and kind of admitting myself I was an atheist was some of the most terrifying moments of my life, just on an emotional level.
I can relate. so, so for you, why, like how, it sounds like you went to atheism pretty quickly. What, no stops along the way, nothing that tried to pull you away to maintain any
Not
level of faith?
really. Yeah, I mean, I was climbing up that slope the whole time, getting closer and closer to God. And then at some point, my foot stepped over the edge and I just plummeted.
That's basically how I describe it for myself as well. Like as soon as I knew I didn't believe basically in the resurrection and the soul, a few other things, I was
Mm-hmm.
like, I'm done. It's over. Like
Yeah.
there's nothing left. So
Yeah. I mean, I don't think you can force yourself to believe something. And like, I tried to hang on to the cliff before I fell, but there was no pulling myself up again.
yeah, that is a terrifying experience. What happened? Like, were you able to talk to family about this? Did you have close loved ones at all that you had to?
I've come clean to a few of my family. A couple of my siblings know.
Okay.
Ironically, I was always the most studious and the most faithful, like godly person in the family. My mom would always tell me. Um, I think I was her favorite child. She's never quite said it, but she's kind of hinted it a few times. And we had a large family too. But like I always had this position of like the priest of the family, the spiritual guru who was going to kind of guide the rest of my siblings and everything. Um, and my dad, though he's a believer, and pretty strong believer, didn't ever really step up to that role as like our spiritual head. So I guess I kind of felt like I needed to take that on.
Okay.
So anyway, it's ironic that I'm the only one who is like open. I mean, well, kind of open about not believing, and
Okay.
all the rest of them still go to church and participate in everything, but don't take it nearly as seriously as I do, which probably is why they're still there.
I think you're onto something. I really do. Yeah. Like you're basically telling my story as well, family wise, family hero from a systems point of view, and like, becoming the spiritual leader that people look up to. And then in my case, a couple decades later, I'm an atheist, and then trying to explain that to my family was challenging.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, I haven't gotten there with my parents yet.
Okay.
They know. I mean, I told my dad once, but I think he forgot. Um, they know that I don't go to church, and they're very distraught about that. They know that my philosophy and politics have changed quite a bit, and they're not very receptive to hearing me try to explain why.
Right.
Um, and like my dad, I think if it were just me and him, I think I could tell him and be honest, and he would be understanding, if not upset. My mom does not process these kinds of things in that way. Her reaction would be much more hard on herself and hard on me and very
Mm.
emotionally driven. And I don't think I could have a very productive, logical conversation trying to explain everything leading up to it, all of my reasons and why I don't believe anymore.
Yeah.
So I am really trying to avoid that conversation with them. I know it has to happen eventually, probably before I eventually bring home a girl who is not a Christian,
Right.
because I know very well what they think about people like that.
Interesting.
Hmm.
For me, it's two living aunts. I've lost lots of family. I'm old. But my two living aunts, like one was really curious and wanted to know and asked me lots of questions. And one, it was that is more like, it sounds like your mom, where that was the thing that bound us together, was that we were both believers. And like
Hmm.
telling her was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Like that was brutal. So, it sounds like this happened near the beginning of the pandemic, which is a rough time for that to happen. So, how did you fare in isolation and, not necessarily having community anymore and exploring what it meant to not be a person of faith anymore?
Well, the first stage of it, I did have a couple roommates who were both Christians. One of them worked for Answers in Genesis, and the other worked for one of their companies that they partner with. And he's now a pastor at a local church.
Okay.
So, like, I did have friendship. I did have some community. I would get involved in a few things, but there were a lot of disagreements over masks and vaccines that now feel like a distant memory. But I'm also incredibly reclusive and have no problem spending weeks alone, other than like going grocery shopping.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
it didn't bother me too much on an emotional level or anything. Um, but I did, like, over time, as I would talk to different friends, like, it just felt like more and more relationships were kind of dying off. Um, and there were a few key people that I considered at the time very good friends. One guy I was even in his wedding, and I would try to talk to them, and like it turned nasty. And with
Yeah.
this one conversation in particular, I'm thinking of, um, and that kind of broke my heart. But there are a few Christians that I'm still good friends with, and they are the exception to the rule. Some of the most genuine, wonderful people I know.
Yeah.
And they, all of them that I'm still close friends with, know that I'm an atheist, and they either don't care, or like we have a cordial kind of bouncing ideas back and forth, but it never turns nasty. We respect each other. And so I'm very grateful for those relationships.
And then what was meaningful for you? Like, were there any books, or podcasts? And I'm not talking about art, this one,
Yeah.
YouTube, that kind of thing. Were there any sources that were helpful for you, or any practices that were helpful for you?
Well, I'll say for podcasts, I have like a 1,500 videos on my watch later list. So I
Yeah.
have I'm not good at like bouncing between different apps. So I don't listen to a lot of podcasts.
Okay.
Videos, I mean, Paulogia, Vice Rhino, Godless Engineer, all the big YouTube atheist creators I've listened to for hours on end at various times.
Yeah.
Um, Yuval Harari's book Sapiens was just mind changing, paradigm shifting for me.
Okay.
That was really incredible. Um, there's a guy on YouTube who has a channel called Acapella Science, who makes science themed acapella songs.
Okay.
And there's one in particular that I really took to, called Evo Devo, that is summarizing, um, oh, what's it called? Endless Forms Most Beautiful by Sean Carroll, I think. It's a book all about evolutionary development, kind of a merger of embryology and evolution. And while I only got halfway through the book and don't understand any of it that I've read so far, the song helped me understand evolution and how it works better than any other like 4-minute video I've ever seen.
Interesting. Okay.
So I've been binging atheist content, been binging a lot of debates. I love listening to debates, and a lot of evolution content, some cosmology, although it's not quite as fascinating to me. I love learning about anthropology and how humans fit into the wider animal family. So that's probably been my area of focus the most.
All right. Oh, very cool. Yeah. And then you are part of our little Facebook community. How did you find out about that? What was like, what drew you to it? And
I think Lars,
okay. Yeah.
yeah, I think he shared with me the episode that he did. I don't know. It's been a while, and I'm so terrible with memory. But I think he was the one who invited me. I was in the Answers in Genesis Facebook group, which is like a religious pluralistic group, very very cordial. There's no debates, atheism or creation or Christians or whatever, but anti Answers in Genesis.
Right.
I was in that group, became friends with Lars. At some point, he told me that he was an atheist and was planning on admitting that to people. Then I think he invited me over to this group, and I've just been kind of building friendships and stuff ever since.
Well, fantastic. Yeah. Very good.
Yeah, it's a great community.
Well, Seth, I really appreciate you telling us your story. I think again, there will be definitely people that relate that, that experience of having very fundamentalist ideas, young Earth creationism, even the change to the Hebrew roots, although that might be rarer, but the concept of going to a new denomination or a new theological framework and being totally dedicated, and then eventually having to let it all go, I think is a pretty common theme. So, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, for sure.
Final thoughts on the episode. I think some of what is interesting about Seth's story is that he got the job at Answers in Genesis, which would be the pinnacle of what a young Earth creationist would want. Come to find out that Ken Ham was not the type of person that he expected him to be. And as he said, you should never meet your heroes. Another aspect of Seth's story that I think is common is the conversion to a new version of Christianity. In his case, Hebrew roots, which entailed a lot more historical background and dietary restrictions. And as he puts it, he was seen as being more legalistic, and yet he was just putting these restrictions upon himself and not asking others to do so as well. But this is very common to just jump in, kind of double down by changing denominations or theologies or churches in an attempt to continue one's faith. In my mind, sometimes the more restrictive that religious tradition is, the more a person who cares about their faith will seek after that, because you're doing something. You feel like you are doing the right thing to get closer to God. Of course, we know the rest of Seth's story. I like the analogies that he used. His faith tendon being stretched and stretched and stretched when some of the Hebrew roots dogmas were around flat earth and the Leviathan as far as the creation is concerned. He had problems with the Trinity, recognizing that he couldn't wrap his head around that. Some really telling moments in Seth's story, talking about sharing the gospel and being afraid of handing off the wrong theology. And so he goes into great detail about doctrine. And he says, as I was saying this, I realized I wouldn't believe it if I were hearing it from somebody else. What a moment that is. Other ways that Seth describes this, he says, there was a point where I felt like a part of my brain just broke. And almost in an instant, I realized I couldn't believe anymore. And so finally realizing that I didn't believe in, admitting to myself that I was an atheist, was some of the most terrifying moments of my life on an emotional level. And then science and critical thinking become an important part to Seth after deconversion. In an email after our conversation, he said, the freedom to think for myself instead of abide by a dogma is impossible to overstate. I'm still very interested in religion and theology and even the Bible, but from the perspective of an anthropologist observing a strange culture. I want to thank Seth for being on the podcast and for sharing his story. I think that many people will relate to it. The aspect of dogma and doctrine stretching just one step too far and then falling off the cliff, like he says, of faith, and realizing that you no longer have the ability to believe. The choice has been taken from you. Thank you, Seth, for sharing your story. It is much appreciated. The secular grace thought of the week is about the inability of apologetics to satisfy the curious. In this podcast, I have intentionally avoided apologetics and counter-apologetics. I've avoided doing response podcasts against apologists. I have had one or two of them on. I generally feel dirty after doing so. But because Seth's story is about Answers in Genesis and Ken Ham specifically, I'm going to take this brief opportunity to talk about how apologetics fails people. There are countless numbers of previous guests who have been on the podcast who grew up in a young earth creationist environment. And then the minute they hit college or even just curiously looking at pop science online and experience a real description of evolution, that falls apart and can generally be the first string that's pulled in the sweater of faith that unravels to nothing. That isn't my experience. I have to rely on the other people like Seth, like friend of the podcast, Matthew Taylor, who have experienced that. But what I did experience is the failure of apologetics to satisfy my desire for answers. Again, though I was never a young earth creationist, I did believe in a God who created ex nihilo out of nothing. And occasionally during the early 2000s, during the intelligent design fad, read a number of books. And I remember the thought over and over and over again that I was convinced of the conclusions that these books were making, but it was obvious to me that the arguments were insufficient, fallacious in some cases, and unconvincing if I didn't already believe the thing they were trying to convince me. And that was definitely a nail in the coffin that led to my personal deconversion. The person who has expressed this the most is former guest Jenna. Jenna said she had a moment of realization as she was talking in a small group where she realized that the answers that they were presenting satisfied them, but the answers did not satisfy her, and she wasn't sure what to do with that. If you are that person, you're listening right now, and you've heard the apologetic answers, and they don't satisfy you, there's nothing wrong with you. The arguments are bad, and it's okay to say that. And even if you decide that you still have faith, like I did while I was still in the middle of my faith, you can recognize that the apologetic arguments are no good. And if you find that that begins the unraveling of faith for you, then you have found some truth. And I promise you that true things don't deconstruct and that you will be the better for it. We have a number of exciting interviews coming up, but I want to begin teasing right now that Arlene, who is the community manager, she is a copy editor. She's an incredible part of the podcast and underpins much of what we do here. She will be guest hosting with several of her friends. We'll get her perspective, and I'm super excited for that. Hopefully in the next several weeks, that episode will come out, so I'll be looking forward to that. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google Deconversion, you can Google Secular Grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.